Thank you again, Travis, for arranging this. So last week, we left off with talking about Jalen Hurts playing in a playoff game this past weekend against the Rams after he returns from the concussion protocol. And I don't envy the decisions the doctors have to make with the NFL. There's so much at stake on both ends. They need to get the players back as quickly and as safely as possible to keep the game going, but also have so much to consider with the athlete's safety. That's not an easy decision to make when there's, multi-million-dollar industry depending on you. And you may have guessed from Travis's comment last week when I brought up Sue Bird. He said, she's probably better than me, and I'm not even good at basketball, which I'm not sure if that's just a programmed male response when hearing about a woman who's really good at a sport, or if it's just a reflection of how little exposure he's had to professional sports. But you may start to get the idea of the lack of familiarity in sports in general as we go through this, but I look forward to watching him learn as we go through all these different sports examples. But for the sake of the podcast, he decided to tune in for at least part of the game to see the real-life applications of what we discussed last week, which was that we know after an athlete returns to their sport after a concussion, they face an increased risk of getting injured.
Right, like we were watching if he was tracking the ball. How much was he interacting with his team, and what was his demeanor like? And I saw he got injured.
Well, that was from a tackle. So we can't say that injury could have been a consequence from the concussion. If he had sustained a non-contact injury, we could look a little closer to see if that could have been a result from a concussion or a connection to the consequences after a concussion.
Why would there be a difference, though?
So in a non-contact injury, the commands from the brain are either delayed or disrupted that control the muscle firing pattern in the legs. And when those commands from the brain aren't executed with that exact precision needed, it can lead to unbalanced forces around the joint that could lead to an injury to the ligaments or the surrounding tissue. But in this case, his injury was due to someone else applying a force to his body. And in sports, some injuries are just a risk of a collision in the game.
But did he do okay otherwise? They won, right? So, I thought he did pretty good. He came back out, so...
So I actually had a patient today, unsolicited, say to me, what's going on with Jalen Hurts? It takes him forever to make a decision. There should have never been a safety. He should have gotten rid of the ball. He kept highlighting the amount of time that it would take for Jalen to read the field and execute a decision. So that patient was actually pointing out decreased reaction time and compromised perception-action coupling.
Perception-action coupling. Can you explain that?
So that's when the brain perceives information. So on the perception side, it's either through nerves in the body or visual input, and has to process that information to make a decision about what kind of action the body's going to take. Spreading my bias onto you now, since you watched the Eagles game.
Right.
And you said, hey, Jalen got hurt. That was something that was supposed to be kind of on what we're looking for if we can tell if he's completely recovered from this concussion or not. But he did complete the return to play protocol. And that's what he said in his press conference about it when they asked how he was feeling. And he repeated back that he had completed the return to play protocol. Now, have you ever heard of that return to play protocol in sports?
Just now.
So essentially, it's a stage of events that has to take place, and the athlete has to be without symptoms to be able to go back. So it starts off with no activity, and then they're allowed to do light activity, and then they can do sports-specific drills. Then from there, they can do limited contact practice, then full contact, and if they're symptom-free for 24 hours, then they can go back to play. So if you condense that down, the fastest you could get through that is a week.
Okay.
But say, for instance, they do moderate intensity and they start to become symptomatic, technically they shouldn't move beyond that phase to be able to go to the next one.
What's a symptom of a concussion?
Symptoms for them is nausea, vomiting, dizziness, headache. anything along those lines.
Okay.
But nowhere in there does it address reaction time, concentration, multitasking. Those aren't part of that return to play protocol. But, as you know, those are all really important components of recovering from a concussion.
Yeah, because you're definitely, everything is a lot more difficult after, especially like acute concussion. Like directly after a concussion, things are acute. I remember when I first came home from the hospital, you know, I knew I had a traumatic brain injury, concussion, that they had told me that, but I really didn't know what that meant until I went to the mall with my mom. My mom, took me to Christian Mall to basically get some clothes, because I had lost some weight. And going to the mall, that's something that I could do pretty easy, typically. Just go to the mall, get some clothes, come home. But I remember going to the mall and watching all the people moving and me moving and hearing all the sounds and seeing everything. It was literally like overwhelming to me. Like that was like running a marathon. We were there for maybe like a couple hours, and I know I came home and like I went right to bed and went right to sleep, and I didn't want to get out of bed for like 2 days. And that was like that was kind of the first realization, like, wow, man, like how am I ever going to go back to work? Because that wiped me out. Like just doing something that I do all the time, completely obliterated me.
So before the accident, you could do that and then carry on to 5 or 6 other activities that day and not even think about it.
No problem.
But after the accident, just getting from the car into the mall, passing other people that are walking a different direction than you, looking at all the signs that are up on the stores, remembering where it is that you would find what it is that you need, all the other conversations that are going around, the lights, it's just a very visually vibrant place. Now all of a sudden, your brain is working overtime just to pay attention to all those things that would normally just pass undetected.
Right. Yeah. It was like processing all that information. I mean, it was like reading like a super complex book, like super fast. Like I remember when I was a kid that things that like kind of made me uneasy or like awkward would be like looking at a shelf in a store that had a whole bunch of those little wires that came out that would hold stuff, like you would put like a bunch of different, whatever product you were, and they slid, the packaging slid and it hung on the hooks. And you've seen a whole bunch of those. Like it always looked really weird to my eyes. And I mean, it wasn't anything major, but I was like, oh, that kind of looks funny. But after, like, when I was going to the mall, that's kind of what I thought of. Like, just seeing every little thing and trying to process all the colors and distinguish between the depths of things and trying to judge if the person next to me was a hazard, or was I going to bump into this person, or was I going to run into the wall, or was I going to trip? Like, it was like a conscious effort to have to process things that usually are, part of the nervous system that just happens. It's like a sympathetic nervous or
subconscious off the radar. Yeah,
you're right. You don't even process them, you just do them. Like I had to process all the things that are normally subconscious, and I don't have to process. Everything was like a fight.
Yeah. And a lot of times in the early stages of concussion recovery, it used to be, and unfortunately sometimes still is recommended by doctors, that you need to avoid noise, avoid sound, put yourself in a cool, dark room and rest. But in those early phases, exposure is so important. But the way I explain it to folks is your job is to put a pot of water on the stove and let it heat up without boiling. So things that add heat are things that require some sort of cognitive strain. So whether it's encountering something that's a visual demand, like going up to a place like a mall where there's a lot of visual stimulus, and then carrying on a conversation, that's another thing that adds heat to the level. And then trying to have some sort of recall of a procedure or a process, that adds heat. Physical exertion, that adds heat. Now, the point of saying that we don't want it to boil, in your scenario, after going to the mall, you reached that boiling point where everything just had to shut down.
Yeah, 100%.
And it took a long time to recover. And ideally, we want folks to understand that if your symptoms increase a little bit, that's okay. You know, if your headache goes from a 2 out of 10 to a 4 out of 10, that's okay. That can recover. That's still just heating the pot. But if it gets to 10 out of 10,
right,
where you're vomiting and we just have a profound exacerbation of your symptoms, that's too much.
Right, like, so if you're bench pressing like 135, you know, we can try 145, but we're not going to go to 225.
Exactly.
Like, that's because you're going to drop that on you.
Yeah, that like intentionally modulated exposure, but the idea of having the exposure is so much more beneficial to the brain than having no exposure.
Like exercise.
Exercise. That's a great example. So the University of Pittsburgh Medical College released this 5-stage concussion protocol. And it was very well researched, and it showed that if we have intentional dosing of exercise, we're seeing folks recover from a concussion faster. Now, the science behind that is as you participate in even light exercise, your brain releases this protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And the release of this protein allows neurogenesis, which is the development of new nerve cells, and neuroplasticity, finding new opportunities for synapses and connections within the brain. So last time we used the example of, you know, the diffuse axonal shearing that you experienced caused loss of that electrical conduction along the extension cord. So with BDNF, we're seeing that with a loss of that electrical conduction between that normal pathway.
What is that? BDNF?
BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
Okay.
So with that, we have the opportunity to grow new extension cords and have them connect in ways that we can find success with things that were otherwise symptomatic.
Okay.
So if, let's say, reading a book out of a chapter book, reading a page out of a chapter book was enough to drive your symptoms up, that light exercise stimulating the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor allows the opportunity for the brain to start finding new connections and that plasticity to start to change and find new pathways to achieve that same task.
So literally exercise for your brain.
Exercise for your brain. And that's something that
And you can overstimulate that, and like just like you would like if you overdid it and you pulled a muscle.
Exactly. Or you could overdo it in terms of too much noise, too much visual stimulus, too much concentration. And that's when folks are explaining those things like you did of, then I just had to shut down for a couple of days and reset.
Yeah.
That's when it gets to the point where it's problematic.
I pulled my brain muscle. Like, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And it needed time to recover, and then you had to build back up. But that opportunity for the brain to have the materials that it needs is like this brain-derived neurotropic factor is essentially like miracle grow for your brain. It gives the right conditions and the right opportunities for your brain to start rewiring.
Nice.
So the protocols that we're using are based on that.
Okay, so brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
Mm-hmm.
So is that like a medication, or is that like
So this protein is something that the brain can synthesize on its own. But believe it or not, I think there are supplements for BDNF, but the real therapeutic side is when your brain starts developing it and using it as needed. So if you're trying to let these new pathways exist, you want to give it the materials, the building blocks it needs. in order for those new pathways to
So
take
is
place.
that like proper nutrition is going to help you, and
Nutrition's important too, and the hydration part's so important.
hydration?
Yeah. But even if you just picture...
I'm never hydrated. And my wife is never hydrated. I've never seen my wife drink water. She's terrible at hydrating.
Yeah, she is.
What is important?
Yes, it's very important.
And so, especially in brain recovery, or
Yeah.
brain-derived neurotrophic factor, water is good.
Water's good in general, but even just in the context of we need to get good oxygenated blood to every area of the brain. So exercise helps stimulate that.
Cardio.
It gives light cardio to moderate cardio. Just stimulates that release.
Is that why I feel good after I run? Like I feel great.
Yeah.
That's why I used to run.
But if you're newly concussed, it probably starts off as a walk.
You're right. Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And then works your way up to that. But yeah, that's the chemical response when you do that. But your insight to that was something that you had to kind of navigate through your own trial and error of finding things to help you heal.
Right. I just guessed.
I'm
gonna try this.
Just started exercising on your own.
Mall, bad idea. Mm-hmm. We figured that out pretty quick. Mm-hmm. Bad idea. So when I was in the hospital, I was very inquisitive, and I would talk to the nurses and talk to the doctors, and they would give me information. And one of the things that they said to me was the number one reason for people people being admitted into the hospital from an emergency room is traumatic brain injury, or and the number one reason for that you would think is like car accidents or fights or something, but literally the number one reason for traumatic brain injury is just falling over, just falling down. And a lot of times that happens to like older people, but that can certainly happen to younger people. I mean, it was so icy today at work. I slipped twice, and we laid salt down, and I was very concerned about somebody falling and hitting their head, because I know the catastrophic things that can come from just falling over and hitting your head. Like it could be very, very bad.
Now, even if you think about what we discussed last time of as family members, as healthcare providers, there's just a lack of general familiarity of the signs of a concussion. So, say for instance, you have a older aunt that, let's say she's 82 years old, but she still lives by herself, still perfectly independent, and she's going out to go to a doctor's appointment, slips and falls on the ice before she gets in her car, and she fractures her hip. So she calls 911. They come pick her up in an ambulance, take her to the emergency room. They start taking x-rays of where she's complaining that it hurts. And they see that she has a broken hip. From there, she's going to be transitioned right over to the operating room, and a doctor's going to put her hip back together. Now, if it's a really sharp emergency room doctor and they're asking questions about how she fractured her hip, and she says that she falls, they'll likely ask if she hit her head. And if she says yes, they might do a CT scan of her head. But unless it's an overt bleed, they're not going to take any action regarding the impact to her head. So then from there, your aunt goes on.
Because you can't see anything but like a brain bleed.
A massive bleed, exactly.
You can't see that with a MRI or a X-ray or a CT scan, unless it's bleeding.
Exactly. So then your aunt goes to rehab, still focused on her hip, gets back to standing and walking, and then they send her back home. And then family members start to notice she's starting to forget an awful lot. And when I talk to her on the phone, she can't quite get her words together.
She's getting older.
Yeah, it seems like she's more confused than she is normally. She's complaining of, that she's unsteady on her feet. So then she goes back to the doctor and say, you go with her, or another family member goes with her, and starts explaining all these symptoms. She can't get her words together. She's just, leaving the stove on, all these other things. Your aunt's more likely to get diagnosed with dementia and treated for dementia than to be treated for the concussion she sustained from that fall. So if we don't have this awareness of finding out more to the story or realizing that these symptoms could have been from an impact to the head or a concussion, it'll get lost in the healthcare system, and then her changes that she's experiencing through her life could be attributed to something that has nothing to do with what's going on.
Because it's logical to diagnose an 80-plus-year-old with dementia.
It is. That's on our radar. That's familiar to us.
Right.
You're old and you're confused. You might have dementia. But it's not familiar to us to say, did you hit your head recently? And if so, when did these symptoms start? Did it start after you hit your head? And if that's the case, what can we do to treat the concussion? Because we know that concussions recover. They can be treated. But they require us to know that there's something that needs to be treated.
Right.
In order for that to happen.
Like you would know your ankle needed to be treated if you couldn't walk right. And every time you hurt, your ankle hurt. You can say, my ankle hurts, but there's no pain receptors in your brain, so you can't be like, my brain hurts.
Yeah. And say, for instance, that, let's say a younger individual in his 20s or so has a car accident at high speed, and he's got broken bones in his arm, maybe lacerations in his organs, and he goes into the hospital, and obviously the expectation for those things to heal is rest. So you're going to stay in bed for a while and you're going to rest. We know that if he was in a car accident, there was a high level of impact, so likely a concussion. But we're inadvertently cocooning these people, putting them into a low stimulation environment, sit back, rest, let your body heal, and we're delaying the recovery of the concussion.
Isn't that good for your brain?
Not the rest part of it if your brain has been injured. So we need to find...
because you need
to start having some sort of stimulus, whether it's concentration-based. And granted, if he has injuries that mean he can't walk on that leg, there's other things that can be done that are very therapeutic to the concussion. Being able to have memory or recall games, being able to tolerate higher levels of visual stimulation, or even VR headsets.
Virtual reality, like
virtual
Apple
reality.
Glass.
Any sort of virtual reality that's going to engage your brain. Now, at the beginning, we brought up Jalen Hurts playing in the Eagles game post-concussion.
Hurt his knee.
Hurt his knee. But we even had outside viewers, just general public, commenting on how slow his reaction time is and how they noticed that there's delays in his decision making. Now, this coming week, the Eagles are going to play the Commanders.
Okay.
And the Commanders quarterback is a rookie this year.
Okay.
But he's incredibly successful.
Commanders, what city?
Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. They used to be I don't think we're even allowed to say it anymore. The Redskins?
Yes.
Okay, so now they're the Commanders.
Now they're the Commanders. Okay.
My football knowledge, I know.
He's going to be an expert
in
sports.
There. I'm getting there. I'm getting way better.
12.
I'm getting way better.
So.
Did you guys know Kobe died? I just found that out.
That's another great example of the cocoon of sports that you've been
right.
in.
I have been cocooned.
So the Washington Commanders quarterback, who, like I said, is having an unbelievable season.
What's his name?
Jayden Daniels.
Daniels, gotcha.
Okay.
Commanders, Daniels. I'm learning.
He's gonna be able to recite the starting five of the Las Vegas Aces by the end of the summer.
I will get good.
So, in his college career, he started at Arizona State, and then went to LSU. So it's Louisiana State University.
Okay.
And had trouble with concussions in his college career. But in an effort to recover from his concussion faster, he started using a virtual reality headset to train his mind while his body was not allowed to endure any impact. Because remember, in that return to play protocol, you can't start encountering impact until you're symptom-free in the earlier stages. So to make sure that he wasn't losing his sharpness or his edge or his understanding of the game, he started using this virtual reality. As he recovered from his concussion, was back into play, he continued using it. Now he's at the point where he's using this virtual reality headset to interact with the game at 1.75 times the speed of normal play. So he is essentially training his visual processing speed. He's training his reaction time. He's training his impulse control, which in sports, impulse control is your go, no-go response. If you're deciding whether I should take on this defender or slide to take it down, or deciding whether you should make a pass or hang on to the ball based on all the other threats in the area, that impulse control is incredibly important to keep yourself safe.
Wait, hold on. Let me get this. You can't move until they hike the ball, right?
Right.
So the one team has got to stay completely still, and they can't cross the line. I remember that.
Yes.
From middle school when I used to like mess around. Okay, so that is impulse control.
On the line, yes. So for the linemen, their impulse control is they cannot go until that ball snapped. Now, do you know what it's called when they move when they're not supposed to?
Hold on. Offsides.
False start.
False start.
So
two words.
Both of them had to do with the line of scrimmage.
Okay.
So offsides was your first guess?
Offsides.
Okay,
right?
so that's when they're lining up past the line of scrimmage.
So when they go past.
When they're they're not on the side of the line that they should be.
Gotcha. But false start
is when they jerk ahead of time instead of waiting for that.
Where's my paper? I gotta write this stuff down.
So, Jayden Daniels has essentially been training throughout the end of his college career and then into his rookie season in the NFL. He's been training the aspects that need to be recovered after a concussion. So this coming week, we're going to see a typical return to play protocol in Jalen Hurts with no training of the cognitive multitasking, no training of the reaction time or the impulse control measures and perception action coupling, all these things that relate to good sports performance. And we're going to see him take on a team that is essentially recovering from a concussion in a magnificent way that trains every facet that needs to be addressed in order for this player to go back to a high level. We're going to see those two face off this coming weekend.
The Commanders and the Eagles.
Exactly.
And the Commanders have been playing at 1.75 times the speed of football.
Their quarterback will feel like everything is in slow motion. Now, the wild part is...
I know. Oh, my goodness.
So, the wild part is, if this starts to catch wind...
Can you bet on sports?
Yes.
Okay.
So, if this starts to catch some momentum and the league is starting to realize, wow, this really elevates the level of play, the NFL will inadvertently be treating concussions that they've been missing out on this whole time.
Well, I know without a doubt, 100% that works well. Because, a lot of times what I'll do is if I'm having trouble, processing a YouTube video, if I'm watching something complicated, I will literally watch it at 1.5 or 1.75 times this fast. And what'll happen is the guy will talk so fast, and then I'll slow it down, and it will sound like he's talking in slow motion. And I can just pick everything up, and you should try that one day. Watch something at 1.75 on YouTube, and then slow it down, and it is everything is moving in slow motion, and it's so much easier to process. So, Commanders, they're playing 1.75 times the speed of football.
Their quarterback sure is. And it's led to some remarkable results. They even compared his what his training was like. What his performance was like before he did the VR headset training. And they're, commenting that he had 17 touchdown completions, and then after he did the VR headset training, he had 40 touchdown completions.
What?
He just recovered from his concussion. That's it.
What?
Yeah. So this remarkable output is because we finally address the brain, and the brain is what controls the body.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. So that's why all these different components that we just have not had the opportunity to address well, because we don't have it on our docket of things to address with someone who's had a concussion. The multitasking part is so important, because if you think about the amount of things a quarterback has to think about in a football game, it's almost like all the things that you had to think about at the mall when it was all something that required your full attention. Just that visual stimuli required your full attention. Just your mom talking to you required your full attention.
Yeah.
Being able to remember what you were there for. You had to stop walking to think about what you were there for.
Right.
Could only do one thing at a time. And actually, did you know that it's been clinically proven that individuals who have sustained a concussion walk slower than their peers who have not sustained a concussion?
Really?
It's called a dual task tandem gait test. So even when folks are far out from their concussion, not just newly concussed, if you had them walk heel to toe, like the sobriety test,
okay,
and then ask them to count backwards by 7 from the number 50, you would be able to identify which ones have had a concussion and which ones haven't.
Count
based
backwards.
on how fast they can do that task.
Count backwards by 7s.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even think I could have did that before I got a concussion. That's pretty 50. What is that? 53.
So 43. So you're going backwards from 50. So 43.
Oh, 43.
Yep, and then 36, and then 49 or 29. So the idea of that
I was never good at math.
is the task of walking heel to toe
Okay.
should not be disrupted by the cognitive task. But if you've had a concussion, that cognitive task now pulls you away from how well you can perform that motor task. So that concept is what we're trying to illustrate with what it means in the sports spectrum, or what it means for you when you first went to the mall. Once your attention has to be applied to more than one thing, those processes become taxed.
Because you got to think about the subconscious things.
Yeah, the things that beforehand didn't require any thought now require some sort of mental tax until you're trained to be able to sustain that multiple attention load.
What happens if you're never trained? If you just...
So the example you gave is going down the same path in a cornfield and then that path gets blocked off. So instead of being able to find a new way to get to that end point of the cornfield, your compensation of it is just going off in random paths each time. And then you have to think really hard how to get back. And it requires a lot of conscious thought process. So if it doesn't get reinforced, if we don't show you that reroute and then force you to go down that reroute so many times that it's your new path, then you're going to have these sporadic paths through the cornfield of all this time and attention focusing on how to get the job done. But if we train it, then that reroute path in the cornfield becomes something that you continue to reinforce, and then we strengthen that synaptic pathway. We're showing the brain that's the successful one, reinforce it. Do it again, make it successful, make it thoughtless. And then once we get to a point where it's automated, then we start challenging it with more layers of concentration. So once you have that reroute established to it's your new primary pathway, then we need to challenge it with all sorts of other stimulus, things that would require you to think harder or to have a more complicated balance scenario or more physical exertion on top of that.
Is that why I keep making the same dumb mistakes in chess? Like, because I swear, so there's a couple things that I learn in chess, right? Because I like chess, terrible at chess, but there are things that people, like I've watched YouTube, and they kind of say, hey, every time this person moves this here, you should move this to this square. Like, for instance, somebody, every time somebody, say black, jumps their knight out, you should move your pawn up, 1 square or 2 squares so that you eliminate that knight from moving to its optimal squares. Like, every time they do it, just don't even think about it. Just move. If you see the knight move here, you move your pawn here. Like, don't even think about it. Just do it. Mm-hmm. So that's similar to what you're saying with this, basically, rehabilitation. You're learning which way, where to put your pawn.
That's one way to think of it. So you're learning, in that instance, you're learning an instinct, right? So it starts off as something that you have to think about. Once I see this here, what is it that I'm supposed to do? Trying to get all those steps in order to recognize that it's something that requires that response. And then as you do it more often, it should become thoughtless. It should be that I see that knight move here, so my pawn needs to go here. That's a different type of learning response, but it's still something that as you first encounter this, it requires a lot of thought and intention. But then as you do it more and more often and have that successful result,
it becomes automatic.
Then it becomes more automatic.
Nice.
Yeah.
I gotcha.
Yep.
So, and that's what essentially, but the football player, on the Commanders, who's been trained, so he's been doing that, but he's been doing it with VR, and he's been doing it at 1.75 times the speed of
normal football
players. So he's like, can I do that myself? Like, if I wanted to learn a new task, like, or what about somebody with like maybe normal?
So if it's a skill or a talent or something along those lines, learning it first is the first step. So you don't want to speed it up before it's something familiar.
Yeah, good point. Like learning to play a piano, you just want to play it slow.
Exactly.
So you get that memory so that you don't even have to think about that.
And then once it becomes automated, then you could challenge yourself by speeding it up. But for him,
or playing guitar.
But for this instance of the quarterback, with that VR headset, he's training visual processing speed. So what he's training himself to do is, as he sees defenses make adjustments or there's players on the field moving a certain way, he's training himself that I'm going to move my pawn here in this instance because their knight went there.
Ah, okay, I got you.
Okay, so because he's training himself to have these successful responses to the stimulus, so whether it's the defender going a certain direction or a shift in the line or even a change in the play call, he's trained himself that he can receive that information visually, process it cognitively, and then have the motor output needed to be able to make the play successful. So he finds the right solution in fast time so that it's easy in real time.
Because when you do that, there are several parts of the brain that information has to travel to and from.
So on the last one, we use the example of a remote control to a TV. So in a non-concussed brain, I push the button on the remote, it goes immediately to the TV, point A to point B. After concussion, that signal from the remote now goes to one mirror, and then it's deflected off another mirror, and then it goes to another mirror, and then ends up at the TV. What this quarterback for the Commanders is doing is being able to take that otherwise delay from the concussion and streamline it through training the brain to receive this information faster and more successfully, so that way his remote is now going immediately to the TV, if not faster than it was beforehand. But in the concussed brain, so for instance what's happening with Jalen Hurts, and as the individual put it so well, that he's just so slow to make a decision when he gets the ball. So for him, that remote control is now going mirror, 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 mirror TV, and in his brain that's checking in with the temporal lobe, checking in with sensory motor information, checking in with the frontal lobe for the decision making, checking in with the back of the brain for the visual motor cortex. all these mirrors are different areas of the brain that now he needs input from in order to have that same desired output.
Right, like the visual part of your brain is all the way in the back. Mm-hmm. And it has to go all the way to, through, up to the front of the brain to say, well, what would I do in this situation? Because that's where my personality is, and that's where I've learned stuff. And then it goes to the sensory part of your brain that says, okay, this is where the ball is in relation to my head, like your peripheral nervous system, and all that's like it's so. See, that's why I was tired in the mall, because that's a lot of stuff.
That's a lot to take in, and it's a lot to process.
Yeah,
and then it's a lot to have the output too. So it all comes together in a way that can seem like somebody has slowed down or has delayed reaction time, but really they're just processing.
Right.
But in Jalen's defense, he's only been put through the exertion side. Maybe they've also done some balance training. Maybe they've also done some ocular motor training. It's hard to say, and that to be fair in that way, we don't know what his recovery path has been to this point. We can just see the output. We can just see what it's like when he plays.
Do you think he was using the VR, Jalen Hurts?
Doesn't look like it. What do you think?
I don't think so.
Yeah, but
I think maybe he could have got out of that dude's way if he was using the VR, because he would have.
I kind of agree.
He would have been like in slow motion, like on Spider-Man, when Spider-Man goes to
So I'd agree with you in some ways that like if he were as sharp as possible, he could have gotten out of the way. But I'd argue that would be more so from his peripheral vision giving him that information. So for instance, as a quarterback, you have to look at so many different points on the field. You have to see where your players are that are running their routes, if they're being covered. If they're being covered, you have to go right to the next option. There's a lot that you have to do visually and cognitively. But after a concussion, a lot of times your peripheral vision is suppressed because it's too much information.
Right.
So you're just focused in, almost like you have blinders on, going from point to point on the field, trying to make those decisions. Your brain's not paying attention to this 280-pound man that's coming at you full speed to be able to get you out of the way in time.
Right. So like I have a whole bunch of books right there, and I can see them, but I don't know which book is where because I'm looking at you.
Okay,
because
so all of your peripheral vision, you don't detect that.
Yeah, it's kind of like my focus is more centered right here, and I can kind of see that, but not to the level of detail that I see you.
Yeah.
But if I look over there, I can see, Crime and Punishment and Lord of the Rings and Dracula but if I look here, I don't, I lose it.
But if there was something moving in your peripheral vision, you oftentimes would have the reaction to it. But if you're newly concussed, that system that detects peripheral vision oftentimes gets suppressed in a way to minimize the disruption to your central vision. But training that component of your peripheral vision can be very helpful to be able to improve athletic performance in that sense, especially in contact sports. Being able to keep yourself safe from other threats.
I gotcha. So you can see things that, yeah, for sure. Like if you can see things moving out of the corner of your eye, or your peripheral vision, you can see things that are flashy or movie or whatever, especially if they're coming towards you.
Yeah.
And then there's all kinds of what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of it. So that's one thing that when I get later at night, when I get tired, I'll find that my word recall is a little bit more difficult. But during the day, I'm usually fine. But when it gets the more tired I get, my word recall gets a little bit fuzzy.
Yeah, it's a little delayed.
Yeah, delayed.
You have to think harder to find the word.
Yeah, and then the harder I think, it's definitely never coming to me then.
And some of this is the power of suggestion. You mentioned that your friend told you, well, if you read a horoscope, you're going to feel like everything in that horoscope applies to you.
Yes.
Now, in our scenario right now, the power of suggestion might be that I gave that example that after a concussion, word recall can become compromised. But it could be that you're just tired because you've had a full day.
Been up since 4 o'clock.
Exactly. So it might not necessarily be that you're still feeling that symptom. It could be that I've identified that as something that could be compromised after a concussion, that it's more on your radar to be able to identify that's what I'm feeling from that.
I gotcha.
But who knows what the word recall was like 2 years ago or 4 years ago. It could certainly have been something that was influenced by that.
Yeah.
So we're excited this week to watch traditional concussion return to play in Jalen Hurts versus a comprehensive train the brain approach to concussion recovery in Jayden Daniels face off.
Right, because he was doing the 1.75 times speed, watching things happening ultra fast, so when he's playing in the game, it looks like it's happening in slow motion.
Exactly. All right, Travis, keep your head in the game.
Thanks again for tuning in to Concussion. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to follow us and share it with someone you may think will find it useful. You can catch us on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. For updates and behind-the-scenes content, check out our TikTok, Instagram, and X. Or join our growing community on Discord, where we dive deeper into concussion recovery and support each other along the way. All links are in the description, so see you there. And until next time, keep your head in the game and keep it protected.